Europe was silent in a way it hadn't been in 6 years. The guns had stopped, the cities still smoked, and soldiers stood in the streets with vacant eyes, unsure whether to cheer or simply breathe. In London, Paris, and New York, crowds erupted in celebration, flags waving, champagne flowing, victory speeches echoing across ruined continents. The Allies had defeated Nazi Germany. The war in Europe was over. But not everyone felt triumph. Far from the parades, in a commandeered headquarters in Bavaria, General George S. Patton stared out a shattered window at a conquered landscape and felt nothing like relief. He turned to his officers, exhausted and grim, still mud-stained from the final push into Germany. No journalists, no reporters, no cameras, just the men who had seen the worst of the war. Patton didn't thank them for winning. He didn't congratulate them on victory. He said something shocking, something no Allied commander would dare speak publicly. "We've defeated the wrong enemy." The room went still. He paced, boots echoing against the concrete floor, cigar clamped in his teeth, eyes sharp with a kind of fury that victory didn't calm. He jabbed a finger toward the east, where the Red Army now occupied half a continent. "The next war is sitting right there, gentlemen, and we're too damn tired to see it." While the world toasted peace, he saw preparation. While politicians negotiated borders, he saw armies digging in. While Europe sighed with relief, he imagined its future, occupied not by swastikas, but by stars and sickles. And if you're drawn to the moments where celebrations hide catastrophes, where one man sees danger long before the world recognizes it, you're in the right place. Stay with this story. General George S. Patton was more than a soldier. He was a force of nature. From the deserts of North Africa to the fields of France and the streets of Berlin, he led men forward when others hesitated. He believed in aggression, movement, shock, not negotiation. Victory was a point on a map, not a moment to celebrate. Patton didn't speak diplomacy, he spoke action. He distrusted political speeches, treaties, and committees. He trusted bullets, tanks, mobility, and time. He viewed war as a sport, brutal, direct, bloody, and he played to win. When millions of Americans returned home from war, weariness and longing for peace, Patton refused to lower his guard. He saw what many refused to admit, that the victory over Hitler didn't guarantee safety. He believed that the vanquished weren't the only threat, because wars don't end with surrender. They end when power balances, or shifts. And in May 1945, Patton believed the balance was shifting. When he said, "We've defeated the wrong enemy," it was more than shock value. It was a warning from a man who had seen the face of war and recognized the next one before it even began. He had the respect of thousands of battle-worn soldiers. He had the scars, medals, and commands. He had earned the right to speak, and damn, he intended to use it. In the days following Germany's surrender, Patton gathered his senior officers in a dim, makeshift headquarters. Maps still covered the walls. The air still smelled of fuel, sweat, and exhaustion. Soldiers outside still slept with rifles within reach, because peace felt fragile, unreal. Patton didn't deliver a speech of triumph. He delivered a prophecy. He lit a cigar, took a slow drag, and said with absolute conviction, "We fought the wrong enemy." The room didn't erupt with argument. It froze with disbelief. Patton wasn't talking about ideology. He wasn't lamenting lost lives. He was speaking cold, strategic calculus. He believed Nazi Germany had been a threat that was collapsing, exhausted, overstretched, technologically cornered. But the Soviet Union was ascending. A battle-hardened empire with millions of troops still mobilized, tanks still rolling west, and commanders drunk on victory and power. Patton looked around the table, eyes blazing. The Russians are now worse than the Germans ever were. He wasn't naive. He knew Americans were tired, mentally, morally, financially. But he also knew something else. Power doesn't wait for exhaustion to pass. He warned that the US Army, still at full strength, still armed, still in Europe, was in its most advantageous position ever to force the Soviets back behind their borders. If they waited, if they demobilized, if they believed peace had been earned rather than borrowed, then the Red Army would consolidate half a continent and never give it back. Patton didn't see a post-war world. He saw a pause, a tightening coil, a second conflict waiting for a spark. His officers listened, not because they agreed, but because they knew he wasn't crazy. He was consistent. He had always been capable of seeing war as movement rather than aftermath. And yet, even these hardened men understood the weight of what he was suggesting. Another war, immediately, against yesterday's allies. It was unthinkable, unbearable, and precisely why Patton believed it might be necessary. Patton didn't keep his thoughts private for long. The very next week, he wrote a candid report to his superiors. No filter, no political polish, just blunt realism. In that memo, he laid out what many feared to even whisper. The Red Army posed the greatest threat to post-war Europe. He proposed preemptive repositioning, not just patrols or occupation, but a firm buffer of Allied forces between Germany and the Soviet sphere. He urged careful coordination with Britain, but also contingency for independent American action if necessary. The memo circulated quietly. Low priority at first, an unwelcome echo of wartime aggression. But among a small group of officers and intelligence analysts, conversations began. What if, just what if, Patton was right? News of the proposal leaked through channels. British officials caught wind. Whispers turned into debates. Washington received cables from European commands, urging caution, but also asking whether the chief victor could afford to stand down while half of Europe rearranged itself under Soviet control. High-ranking American generals convened behind closed doors. Their faces were weary, solemn. Some scoffed at the idea. The war was over. Others listened too long. The air was thick with history being made, or avoided. In those tense hours, a question echoed quietly but loudly inside the Pentagon and White House. Could America win a war before the ink on the surrender papers dried? They didn't answer. Not yet. But for the first time since 1945, the possibility of a second conflict, not far from the front lines, not years ahead, seemed dangerously real. News of Patton's warnings didn't stop at the American chain of command. They crossed the channel, landing on the desk of a man who understood the stakes better than most, Winston Churchill. By 1945, Churchill was exhausted, politically weakened, and painfully aware that Britain had paid a cost from which it might never recover. The empire was stretched thin. Cities had been bombed into rubble, treasury drained, but his mind was still sharp. Sharp enough to see the outline of the future that Patton feared. Churchill had long distrusted Stalin. He had watched German and Soviet ambitions collide, then cooperate, then collapse. He had seen the Red Army pour into Eastern Europe, not as liberators, but as conquerors. And he knew a harsh truth. Victors don't relinquish territory, they extend it. When Patton's assessment reached London, Churchill reportedly shook his head, not in disbelief, but in recognition. He understood the logic. He understood the threat. He even commissioned a theoretical plan, a classified study known as Operation Unthinkable, to evaluate the possibility of a surprise Allied offensive against Soviet forces in Europe. The results were sobering. The Soviets had more troops, more armor, and strategic depth. The Allies were worn down, divided, and politically paralyzed. The people were war-weary, desperate for peace, unwilling to commit to another continent-wide bloodbath. Churchill believed Stalin was dangerous. He believed the Soviet Union would become an imperial adversary, and in many ways, he agreed with Patton's fears. But he also recognized the terrible cost of confronting that danger directly. As one British official summarized, with grim clarity, "We are capable of starting a war with Russia. We are not capable of finishing one." So Churchill did what statesmen do. He calculated the odds, weighed the blood against the victory, and swallowed the bitter conclusion: war was coming, but the West was not ready for it. And even if Patton was right, even if the window of advantage was real, the world simply couldn't endure more sacrifice. Not yet. While London debated theory and Washington wrestled with exhaustion, Moscow studied personalities. Stalin didn't need a memo to understand Patton. He already knew who he was. Soviet intelligence had monitored the American general for years. His speeches, his temperament, his victories, his controversies. To Stalin, Patton wasn't a decorated commander. He was a dangerous wild card, a man whose pride could drag nations into disaster. Reports circulated through the Kremlin describing him as impulsive, arrogant, ambitious, and prone to reckless proposals. In Stalin's mind, that combination wasn't just irritating, it was combustible. He didn't believe that the United States, as a state, would initiate a new war. American leadership was pragmatic, democratic, painfully cautious. But Stalin feared the one variable he couldn't control: a military icon who could influence public opinion faster than politicians could contain him. Patton's words, "We fought the wrong enemy," weren't just offensive, they were alarming. Soviet spies reported them back to Moscow almost immediately. Behind closed doors, Stalin paced the floor of his office, listening to terse summaries from NKVD officers. He asked direct questions. How many men does Patton command? How loyal are they? How quickly could they move? This wasn't paranoia. It was security calculus. The Red Army sat stretched across Eastern Europe, exhausted, brutalized but massive. Millions of soldiers under orders to secure Berlin, Warsaw, Prague, Vienna. To Stalin, occupation wasn't decoration, it was insurance. And he understood the timing better than anyone. The Red Army was at its most vulnerable when it was victorious. If the West struck now, with fresh armor, intact logistics, and morale high, the result could be catastrophic. So Stalin did what he always did in moments of uncertainty. He tightened his grip. More troops, more security, more interrogations, arrests, executions. Not because he expected an attack, but because he feared an unpredictable opponent who might spark one. Stalin didn't fear American democracy. He feared an American general who didn't believe in limits. A general who, in Stalin's words, was an adventurer. And adventurers, in his worldview, were not to be trusted. They were to be watched. In the months after victory, while the West demobilized, celebrated, and sent soldiers home, the Soviet Union moved with the opposite momentum, tightening its grip on every inch of territory it occupied. What looked like liberation in May became consolidation by August. Red Army tanks stayed in the streets of Prague, Warsaw, Bucharest, and Budapest, not as guests, but as guards. Soviet officers replaced German commanders, then replaced the local officials who dared to resist. Elections were staged, rigged, nullified. Opposition parties were outlawed. Intellectuals disappeared. Journalists died quietly. Factories, schools, ministries, all absorbed into a system that did not tolerate dissent. To the outside world, it appeared swift, inevitable, the price of a continent rebuilding. But behind the iron doors of the Kremlin, there was urgency. Reports of Patton's comments reached Soviet leadership, and though Stalin didn't believe an attack was imminent, he understood the psychology of power. If the West ever tried to push back, they would strike first where control was weakest. So he made sure there were no weak points. Soviet security forces accelerated their takeover. Arrests increased. Show trials resumed. Red Army units were ordered to crush resistance with overwhelming force. Not gradually, but immediately, decisively, brutally. In the West, this looked like paranoia. In Moscow, it looked like preparation. Patton, without firing a shot, had influenced Soviet policy. His warnings, filtered through intelligence networks, press statements, and gossip among generals, convinced Stalin that ideological confrontation was not a theory, but a future. Whether the Americans were ready or not, the Soviets would be. And the transformation of Eastern Europe, from liberated territory to hardened frontier, began not with diplomacy, but with fear of a possibility. A general who might convince America to march again. The Cold War didn't start when politicians said so. It started when armies refused to leave, and Stalin made sure his would never retreat. History remembers victory as a moment, but sometimes a victory is the beginning of fear. Patton believed the war was never over, that Hitler's defeat was only one chapter. He saw a continent shifting under silent boots and quiet orders. He warned that the next war might start, not with a call to arms, but with a whisper in a memo. Stalin understood, not as a moral man, not as a liberator, but as a realist who believed in control, in power lines drawn on maps, in territories held forever. He didn't hate Patton personally. He feared what Patton represented, the unpredictable use of force, not for defense, but for preemptive dominance. So the guns were quiet, but the lines were drawn, and Eastern Europe became a silent chessboard. Kings, pawns, and invisible borders drawn in blood and doubt. The world didn't notice the shift at first. Celebrations faded. Refugees returned. Cities rebuilt. But the sights of Soviet tanks patrolling Prague, the secret police arresting dissenters in Warsaw, the whispered fear in Budapest hallways, these became the real monuments of the war's end. Patton saw the spark. Stalin made sure it didn't die. And decades later, when iron curtains rose and cold wars froze continents, history traced the fault line back to one moment in 1945 when victory meant power and power meant control. Because sometimes the end of one war is just the beginning of another. If you want to explore more hidden moments where war didn't end, it changed, subscribe, and walk with us through the stories the textbooks won't tell. In the summer of 1945, the world wanted silence. It wanted parades, medals, weddings, rebuilding, not another war, not another map drawn in blood. Politicians promised peace. Newspapers promised normal life. Families prayed that history had finally learned its lesson. But Patton didn't believe in promises. He believed in patterns. He looked at the Soviet flags rising over shattered capitals and saw not liberation, but occupation. He saw armies that didn't return home, borders that didn't reopen, prisoners who didn't get released. He saw a world shifting from open warfare to quiet domination. And when he said, "We defeated the wrong enemy," it wasn't nostalgia for the fight. It was fear of the future. Patton didn't want another war. He wanted to prevent one. But the West was exhausted, naive, hopeful, and it wasn't ready to listen to someone who saw danger before it materialized. Stalin, on the other hand, listened very carefully. He didn't panic or retreat or negotiate. He did what ruthless men do when they sense a threat. He consolidated power before anyone else understood. The game had changed. The world would come to call it the Cold War, a struggle of spies, armies, ideologies, walls, and proxy conflicts. Patton didn't live to see it. Stalin didn't live to finish it. But both men, in different ways, helped build the world that followed. One with warnings, the other with walls. And maybe that's the tragedy of 1945. The man who saw the coming storm had no voice. The man who prepared for it had all the power. If you're fascinated by the hidden moments where peace was an illusion, where history could have turned differently, where one voice could have changed the fate of nations, this channel is for you. Subscribe and uncover the stories the world tried to forget. Because history isn't made only by victories, but by visions no one was ready to believe.